some ideas that have developed as the conference has gone on, in which I've really tried to group together here some key ideas and key themes that have come up, particularly as we think about how this could be framed as a set of publications contributing to this really neglected idea of thought, the thought of the Salaf. So I think there are 7 kind of salient themes that I want to touch upon. The first is this idea of the transformation of authority. I think particularly in the first session that we had yesterday, which focused on the Salaf in within early Sufi movements and Sufi texts. The Salaf, we learnt about the Salaf as friends of Allah, friends of God. And so one of the things that struck me was the way in which the category of wilaya ends up becoming perhaps more important than the category of the Salaf. And so this is a way in which when we're looking for the Salaf and when we're looking for the thought of the Salaf, we really have to look at other categories and other frameworks that for different movements become more important than the Salaf. And so perhaps when we try to posit this idea of silence, what we really need to look for is actually shifting categories and shifting frameworks. And I think those the two talks really brought that home, especially because in the modern period, Sufism really becomes the kind of the bogeyman of Salafi movements. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that we do have these changing categories that become more important than just this term, the Salaf. So that's this first idea of how the authority of the Salaf is transformed. The second point is that I think has come across very strongly is that authority is not equal. There are hierarchies among the Salaf, and many of the debates that we've seen in the presentations pertain to debates about these hierarchies. Okay? Yes, the Salaf are, this denotes a historical period, a vast historical period, 3 generations, but even within each generation, we have hierarchies. Those hierarchies become particularly important, I think, for legal authority, I think, as we've seen in the presentations, because that provides different jurists who have their own hierarchies with flexibility to be able to come up with new typologies of the sources for revelation and how one can begin to argue for the authority of one position or another. And so I think those hierarchies become very important for discussions of usul al-fiqh, especially. And I think, Rana, when you were speaking, both Shahnaz and I, we had our kind of our eyes opened up because of this phrase that we found of the reference to usul al-fiqh explicitly in the text that you were showing. Then we have the issue of the hermeneutics of the Salaf. And here we've had some presentations which have, I think, tried to get beyond also this idea of, well, are the Salaf really silent? Okay, and I think it's possible to, resurrect a set of hermeneutical traditions among the Salaf. And really getting beyond this idea that the Salaf are mere transmitters of dicta, or that they are merely names that are cited, right? And I think this goes to the bigger point of, in terms of when we look at early Islamic thought, we tend to gloss over the Salaf as producers of thought, producers of idea, and we tend to jump to the kind of later formative period. And so part of that silence is actually part of our own glossing over some very serious hermeneutical debates that are taking place among the Salaf. The fourth point that I'd like to draw attention to is, I think we saw, especially with yesterday's presentation, that in some cases, silencing the Salaf becomes necessary. Okay? And this was in Professor Rodrigo's talk, where we had this idea that not all of the thought of the Salaf actually should be transmitted. Not all of it is worthy of being transmitted. And I think it was quite important that in order to get that point across, Professor Rodrigo used the example of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I think that was particularly important because of this idea that we have this internal critique and discussion that's taking place about, in the words of yesterday's presentation, good Salafism and bad Salafism. And what that also shows us is the varieties of Salafism that exist. And it's a variety that figures like Ibn Taymiyyah are very keen to draw out and emphasize. The fifth point, the question of the dynamism of Salafi thought. And I think this came across very well this morning, in this morning's presentation, the first presentation that we had, in which we're able to see how specific events and specific cases give rise to a dynamic engagement with Salafi thought, right? So we were given this morning, we have 4 different authors, all of whom within the Shafi'i tradition, and certain historical events, historical cases, in this case events that are taking place in Lebanon, perhaps events that are taking place in Mamluk Cairo, they bring to life a legal discourse which brings to life the authority of the Salaf. And so I think here we're able to really move beyond this idea that the Salaf, or the thought of the Salaf, is a body of static doctrine that is just sitting there and being repeated. No, different cases, different events result in the dynamism of the thought of the Salaf really coming to the fore in being used in different ways and to different ends. Then we have the idea, I think, of the consolidation, but also the contestation, I would add here, the consolidation and the contestation of the authority of the Salafs. And so I think we've seen just in this session that even within the theological, heresiological tradition, we have very hostile contestations around the authority of the Salaf. And also how different theological schools are depending on the thought and the figures of the Salaf in very interesting, but also in these contesting manners. Okay? And I think that contestation also results in the consolidation of the Salaf within different theological schools. I think one of the things that came out of the discussion between Jawad and Azgan was that there is a kind of evolution in which both the Salaf but also terms and the way that different theological groups use the Salaf, over time this changes, right, from the early period into the formative period. And so that consolidation we begin to see over time, and I think the theological texts are a good reflection of that process of consolidation. Finally, this question of the Salaf and the authority of the Salaf, or the silence of the authority of the Salaf. I think part of this has to do with, as we saw just in this session, this question of geographical silence. You know, as long as modern scholars, you know, neglect or overlook certain regions, in this case, Bilad al-Sham, that produces, it's an overlapping discourse, because as we saw with the travels of Awza'i, you know, they are traveling across the different centers and provinces of the Islamic world, but then they decide to come back, and there's a tendency of modern scholars to kind of then just forget about them. Okay, so Awza'i is often mentioned in the context of Iraqi polemics and discussions, but then when he goes back, what's really happening in the periphery? Okay, how are these Salaf being, how are they understood, how are their ideas being engaged with in the periphery? And the example that we had today was of Bilad al-Sham, but there are other regions, you know, Andalus is a good example, which we were hoping would be represented and may be represented in the final version of the publication. So I think, just to conclude now, I think what's come across from this conference is, of course, we've had, I think, new and serious documentation of the thought of the Salaf in a way that we've not had before. And this is an important milestone in modern scholarship when it comes to the field of early Islamic studies, number one. Number two, also the construction of authority, right? Authority is, it's a term that looms very large in the field of Islamic studies, but I think here we're able to pin it down to a specific key term, the Salaf, and I think that's how the field really needs to, rather than using authority in such a wide or capacious sense, these case studies are going to be very important. Number three, this idea of silence. You know, the conference began with this idea of silence, and I think very quickly, within 2 days, we've been really able to move very far, and to be able to look at silence, the reasons for silence. Is there really silence? In what cases is silence actually becomes a theological necessity? And so I think here we have, you know, 7 or 8 or even more, and I'm sure we will get more approaches to this question of the authority of the Salaf and how it is constructed and developed, not just in the early period, but really from the 7th to the 15th centuries. So it's a very sketchy presentation. You know, I had to fill in some comments just as Rana and Adrien were finishing up. But I hope that conveys some of the results and some of the key ideas that have come across from the conference. And hopefully we will see some of these documented in a publication, a special issue of the journal. And with that, I would just like to thank all the participants, all of our guests for coming, especially our speakers who came from we're in Mamluk Cairo, so I can call America peripheral region, you know, these other peripheral areas. Really appreciate it. But also thanks must go to IDEO and to the American University in Cairo, and a special thanks to Dalia and Marwa and the team that really worked on making sure that this conference went as smoothly as it did. And also thank you to the director for his support, and thank you very much.
Thank you.